welcome to our BBC night and welcome to SEMPTI and ACS people. My name is Paul Broderick, I'm the chair of SEMPTI Australia. We've got a number of people here tonight to speak. We'll start off with Butch. He's started with BBC in '53, I have heard, somebody told me. And no doubt you've got a few tales to tell of some of that time. And we'll follow up with Ray and Bernard after that. So without too much more waffle, I'd like to hand over to Butch and we can get the evening started.
I first joined BBC in 1953 in World Service. It was called the General Overseas Service, shortwave radio. And I managed to transfer to television, but it was in engineering, which went right over my head. And I got to work at Alexandra Palace, which is where the first TV sister program, regular programming started, 1936. And it was bizarre because the transmitter was on the ground floor of the building, first floor, right above the transmitters, with the studios, two of them, with the aerial on the roof. So we had all sorts of problems. And my first job in television was to get some brass polish and a little bit of cloth and polish the seals around the door that entered the control room. So it made a complete, I think it was Faraday cage. Yeah, that's what I did. Then when we went to air with the news bulletin at 6 o'clock, had a bizarre system in those days. The picture came out of the standard Emitron cameras like that, key shape, and had to be twiddled, but they didn't have any monitors to look at. They had to do it on their waveform. First one guy sat and he had two cameras to do. He sat on a low stool. The next one had two cameras to do and he had a high stool so he could see over the bloke's head. And I sat at the back on a very high stool so I could see over everybody's head. And I lifted the picture 5% above black level on air by twiddling a knob, and that was it. And if we got through the evening news without a disaster, we're dead lucky. Now, that is the original manual for the entire TV system, the standard Emitron system, from the pulse generators through to the aerials. Issued 1936, it's complete with all the circuit diagrams in there. And you had to sign the official secret act until it's heavy. And before you got it. I then applied for a job as advertised as film trainee, and I became the first film camera trainee in BBC television in 1954. 1955. In those days we were based at Lime Grove Studios, which was an old film production setup.
Gainsborough Studios.
Gainsborough, yeah. And there were so many, I don't know whether I should say this, so many Jewish people running it, was called Ginsberg's. It's been knocked down since, and it was in the middle of a residential street, and there was a studio on the first floor, two studios on the first floor, three, and then two studios on the fourth floor. So everything had to be elevated up. And the film unit operated in a back area at the side of the building for quite a long time, until 1955 when BBC bought Ealing Studios. And I can remember the first day we went there to open it up as a TV film studio. And it was vast buildings and studios we'd never seen the size of before. Exactly, rough floors, because there was a film. They used to nail things down. And it opened in 1902 as a film studio. BBC got it in 1955, had it for 40 years, still operating. And it's in a residential area. There's a big park at the back of the stages. Shortly I'll show you what it looked like from the front. But it was surrounded by houses, and we had a back lot, which was a street with pubs and things in it. Until early in the 50s, we had a night shoot out there for folk opera called The Saint of Bleecker Street, and the neighbours complained about the noise, and that was the end of that. We could only shoot in daytime. And from there I went to proceed on to, and one of the things that got pounded into your head in those days by BBC was that you didn't choke yourself on these things. Advertising was totally forbidden. All the money came from licence money, and even a street shot, you couldn't shoot it if you could read any advertising. And I got hauled over the coals because they gave me a bell and howl one night and said, we're doing boxing and we just want close-ups of the boxers. And I did quite a few shots where the boxing shorts had Everlast written there, and that was forbidden. And that got boom into my head that you couldn't do it. Later on they grew up and let us do it, but you could do a shot of a truck arriving, nothing on the side, but it'd go past and have express dairy on the back. Had to be cut out. That was a bit tricky. And there were a few other things that focus was the most important. Clean gate and focus. And it was drummed into me that if you could make a mistake on all sorts of things and we can fix it, we cannot fix focus. And the gate had to be cleaned between every shot. And we had the most amazing cameras. There was a thing called a Newman Sinclair. And it was looked like an aluminium lunchbox, that big, with a leather handle on the top. 2 winding handles, it was clockwork. And it had a magazine which you loaded, 200 feet of film. So you got a 2-minute run. And we used to do whole 50-minute shows on this damn thing. And you could hear it half a mile away. It made a terrible noise, as though it was perforating the film as you did it. It did frequently if you didn't get it right. And we had a Mitchell, and we had 2 Mitchells. One had an optical head in it, and we used to use that on current affairs. Save all the nonsense of having sync and all that problem. I can remember taking it to Syria in the 50s, and lead acid batteries about that long and about that high went in the hold of the aircraft, and nowadays I think, how the hell did we ever get there? You know, if one fell over, we'd have a problem. And we... What was the other thing we had? Had a thing called the Everest, Vinton Everest. You know, Vinton tripods? They built a camera called the Everest. And it was a black box, about that size. You lifted the lid up, and it had 2 separate magazines. One was a 1,000-foot feed canister on one side and a 1,000-foot take-up on the other, and they had drunken loops to come out of there and go through the gate and pick up on the other side. Made good pictures, but the back of the gate had been cut out. So when you put your eyes to the viewfinder, you were looking at the image on the film. And that was quite good, but you had to remember there was a great big hood that went over the top to stop light leaking back inside. And it worked for quite a while until anti-halation coatings came along, and that was out of fashion overnight. It worked. you couldn't take it out on location. It was too big, too heavy and what have you. One occasion, one of the small stages at Ealing Studios, it was called the model stage, we were doing a tracking shot on a velocilator, you know, those things that weighed 3 tonnes sort of thing, with the Mitchells, the Everest sitting there, me pulling focus and the camera operator on it, and we went through the floor. Crash right through the floor. And that was the end of that. It became the back office after that, where all the dirty work was done. And BBC, it was intent on camera developing and technique and stuff. And they had a problem with, me too, clapperboards. Oh, we'll just get it without a clapperboard, don't worry, you know. And the rule was there's no such thing as a silent shot. And they took a Camiflex camera. That was curious, right, because it had, you could change the gate and the claws and all the rest of it. You'd run 16 mil or you could run 35. It also made a noise. You know, you could hear it down there. Planning people built a thing where Camiflex there, in the middle was a motor, and over here was a Naga recorder, all hooked up to the one motor. So you could use this thing by opening it up, loading it all up, getting it all right, closing it down, locking it off, do a shot with a clapper on it, run your shot, turn it off, and you could start again and it'd still be in sync. The planning department didn't realise acoustics, and they put plastic fiberglass cover blimp. It was about that thick. And we were going to go to the south of France to do a story with Somerset Maugham, and they said, do double camera, and the box that the planning people had built was too big to go in the hold of the Viscount aircraft. So this thing had to go in, and it survived. We actually got to shoot it, but it was a bit of a... You could only use 400 feet of 35mm film. I always carried a Bell and Howell, which is in the cabinet over there, 16mm. And at one stage in Vietnam, when we'd lost our sound camera, I shot a whole story on the Bell and Howell, mute, and we'd run it with the sound recorders to start, and we'd put a clapper on. We'd get about 12 seconds that you could use as sync. So the 20,000 cutaways in that film, some awful stuff. There was a great complaint about the amount of lighting that people used in the studios and what have you, and BBC bought everybody, all the cameramen, a set of Disticon lenses. They were the Zeiss things, very sharp but wide open, what have you. And everybody used, oh great, we got all these new lenses. Then there was a memo came out saying, be careful, the monthly cost of lighting hasn't gone down 1 penny. Yeah, people just pouring the light on them and stopping them down. And 16mm wasn't accepted until 1958. It wasn't up to standard as what engineering considered a good image, and we just had to do it. And we were at the Commonwealth Games in Cardiff, 1958, and that's when we used the standard ARRI 16 for the first time. In the 70s, I was offered, they said, we're updating cameras. You can have an Arton 16mm or you can have an SR 16. So I tried the Arton first, and it had a little visual display in the viewfinder, at the top of the viewfinder, as to what your exposure was. Drove you nutty, you know, drove me nutty. And I asked engineering, I said, can you black that out and cut it off? And they stuck a bit of black paper over it. And as far as I know, it's still there. And I chose the SR and didn't have one problem with it. Oh, we had a lens in South Africa once. The glue on the front element parted and we had a mess there. We went to colour neg and then reversal. And 16mm reversal doesn't give you a plus or minus anything. You've got to be right on. Otherwise you've got a mess. Rosemary, who's standing over there, has put together a few pictures. Now some of these are, you'll be appalled at the quality. They are standard 8 Kodachrome 1950s of these cameras in action, and an occasional black and white shot of the cameras I've been talking about. Oh, I got lowered down the face of Big Ben. No safety, nothing, no safety belts or anything. I found out about that location the morning we were going to do it. They said, "Oh, you're doing Big Ben this morning, you know," and that was that.
Was it a news story or was it?
It was a in the kids program called Blue Peter. It was the story about the biggest clock and best clock in the world.
Yes, and it's not the kind of clock you find ticking beside your bed when you wake up in the morning. This one is over 4,1700 times bigger. It's the most famous clock in the world, Big Ben, and one of our greatest tourist attractions. But a couple of weeks ago, I got a closer than usual view of it when I went to wash its face. Keeping Big Ben to time is surprisingly simple. These old pennies act as timing weights. If the clock's running slow, one more penny on the stack will make it go 2/5 of a second faster in 24 hours. 1 penny less will slow it down by the same amount. Giving Big Ben a wash and a brush-up is a task for the experts. Not very big, is it?
Well, it's big enough for you, I think.
Do I wear a harness as well? Or?
Well, you no need to. It's quite safe.
Okay.
It's quite safe. If I can...
I wasn't the only one to go over the side. The Blue Peter cameraman, Butch Calderwood, went down too. And this was the first picture he took.
Slide the knot down.
I can't believe it, I'm back.
What a way to get a good view over London.
The worst part of that story was the fact that Big Ben struck while we were up there. There's Camiflex being used. That's Coventry Cathedral. We used to stand on the top of those wagons and do all sorts of things. That's a guy called Tubby Englander. You're lucky we didn't have to use that. That's a Technicolor 3-strip. We had one day. That's the front of the studio in a residential area. That's all you saw. Go through that gate. There's a long drive down through the garden, and then whoops, see, it's all happening, you know. That's me with a 16mm on the stages. He's breaking the rules, he didn't put it down. Everybody's got a tie on except me.
You didn't get your annual increment.
No. That's the Newman Sinclair, the lunchbox. Yeah. And notice how we're shooting. Yeah? And there it is again. They're the two winding handles.
And News, what size was your crew?
For a thing like that is about 4 people. Yeah. There's the standard Arri, which I worked with for many years, and that's it with the 400-foot magazine on, which made things, and there's the magazine with all the bits on it. This is one of the last things I did in Vietnam during the war, and it's from the government highway through this little village to where we're going to go and spend the day with the Viet Cong. And the boatman had to take us. The second guy in the boat is Freddie Downton, whom I worked with for many years, sound recordist. And that's the army watching and stopping other people joining in the party. This is Ektachrome and handheld. And this little sequence with all the children was that during the war days, when any whites turned up, the kids were taught to run away and hide wherever they could. But because there was this so-called peace thing going on, they made us most welcome. This film upset the Vietnamese government like you wouldn't believe. Here we were hobnobbing with the enemy. And this guy had filched this off an American corpse. And the Viet Cong used to get the local boys to join in the fight. And because they were being filmed, they all had their hair done.
Looks good.
That flag that's flying in the background is the Viet Cong flag, and that says, "Welcome to Hoa Binh," to the peace negotiations that were going on. And this was the conference we had with the Viet Cong leader, but it got interrupted by the Vietnamese army, and we had to leave. And this is how we got away. Led by a girl. That flag is the Viet Cong flag. I've still got that at home. Yeah.
You stole it, did you?
Yeah. Learned from my father, who stole the candlestick. Yeah. That's the Mitchell that eventually had the sound head in it. The worst thing you could do with this thing is the rack over mechanism. After you'd shot, you could rack the movement over. And if you didn't rack it back, you got a half a picture. And you knew if you were shooting on the stage, the operations manager would burst in there about 10:30 in the morning carrying the negative to embarrass you and everybody else. This is the double camera. The Camiflex and the sound recordist. It made good pictures, but it was tedious to use. It was heavy. Needed 2 people to lift it up to the tripod so you didn't sort of run around and do things with it.
No handheld stuff, would
you? No way. Not even in a car. They were very proud of it, and it worked for a while, but not practical. Not practical. Made pictures, and the sound was okay. That's the Camiflex camera. That was the one that was on the inside of that box thing. Handheld, yeah. Portable. Transportable is the word, yeah. And we did stand on top of those little toy cars, you know, and track.
Did they drive around with you on the roof?
Yeah, no problem. This was the thing with the Canadian Air Force. Looks like 100 years old, that jet. This is me with a BL climbing on board an aircraft called the Weightless Wonder.
Nice air bridge.
And you got a certificate to say if you vomited in that. Yeah. I didn't. And that's the end of this whole fart stories.
Thank you very much, Butch. Some great tales there from not that many decades ago, really. So I'd like to introduce Ray, wherever he's gone. Here he is, just to talk about. Well, we've heard more on the news. Would I say news side of the story? I know we current affairs.
BBC News was totally separate from anything that Ealing Studios did.
Oh, okay. We have a different perspective on filming. That's Ray. Thanks, Ray.
Yeah. Well, I don't have such a broad sweep as Butch, obviously. How did I all start? Well, I started work here at Channel 9. I'd been at my father's garage in Palm Beach, and I got sick of greasing cars and doing all that sort of stuff. And he said, "Why don't you, no interest in the business?" I said, "Well, yes, I have, but I don't want Henman and Son across the portal. What do you want to do?" I said, I want to show films. I want to get into films." He said, "Well, start a little theatre in our garage." So we did that. And as a sort of 14-year-old or something, I was going into the city and picking up feature films and shorts from Royal Bank and Shell and all the rest of them. And we'd come back on the 150 bus to Palm Beach, and then we'd show Friday night, Saturday night and Sunday night. This is way before Avalon Theatre was built. And that all sort of worked pretty well. And then Avalon Theatre was built, and I transferred over to there. And I was there for a couple of years. And one of the one of the customers worked for Samuel Taylor's, and they said, "This industry's going to fall apart. You know, television is here with us." And it started, obviously. And "I can get your son in there, you see. Where does he want to go?" So I started talking to him, and he said, "Well, you want to go to 7 or 2 or 9? I said, "Well, I looked at the map. I thought, well, 9's the closest." So over to Willoughby I went. Willoughby was an old dairy, right? And that's where it all began. And thereby I started in lighting, and I was there for 1 or 2 years in lighting. Went to camera, and that was my bit. So it was studio camera, it was OB camera, and it was films for bandstand. And that's where I really touched the film base. Many nights, drunken nights at the 729 Club meant that I met up with a lot of guys from the ABC and 7, whatever, in Falcon Street, which you might remember. And they said, "We're going overseas to seek our fame and fortune," or words to that effect. And all of a sudden I found myself on the good ship, the Eleanors, 150 quid ticket to Piraeus, and away we went. And over there, through Germany up to the Hook of Holland, and so over to through to Dover. And there, as most Australians did in those days, you walked around London, you saw London, and it was all very great until you started to run out of money. And I thought, well, I better sort of get a job and do something, you see. I'm not going to write home and say, "Dear parents, I've run out of money." So as I'd started as a projectionist, I took a job as a assistant at the Plaza Theatre at Piccadilly Circus. Now this was a Paramount house, lots of prestige, but they didn't pay money to their staff. And I thought, well, why is this? It was a non-union theatre, so it was a third, the wages were a third less than anywhere else. I thought, oh, it's going to be a good experience. So I went up there, met the old projectionist. He said, "Yeah, we've got 2 Philips 3570s up here, and we've got 2 old Simplex, and I want them used all the time." I went through the war years with these cameras, projectors, and I said, "Oh, okay." But then, of course, you'd start there, and of course, no one would turn up. Your assistant didn't turn up. I was made projectionist within the first week, and we're showing In Harm's Way in 70mm, a dreadful Otto Preminger thing that was blown up from 35mm. And so lots of stories there. But anyway, I'd written off to the BBC because it was summertime and staff go on holiday, go to Spain and do all that sort of stuff, and they're left. Now, there were something like 25 crews in 1960, and by 1965 when I joined, there was approaching 50 full crews. I'd also written to Granada Television, and Granada said, come up for an interview, and they never interviewed people at the actual studios. It was in the New Theatre Hotel across the road, and that's where they spent all their time. So the interview was there over many pints of nice warm beer. And they said, yes, you want a job with us? I said, yes. They said, good, well, we're offering you X amount, which is about half the amount of what I was getting at Channel 9. I said, well, can you do any better than that? Well, let's just think about it. So I went back to London. BBC had sent me a letter in between times, said, come in for an interview. I thought, oh, that sounds good. So I went over there, past Michael Balkin's office, and walked to the studios, and there was a set of Lady Killers, one of their last films that was shot there, all sitting around there. I got another phone call from Granada, and they said, look, we're going to offer you the A-grade position. Please come up again. And I thought about the rain continually in Manchester. I thought, no, I'll stay in London. Took the 2 months job. My first job was 3 months overseas with Alan Wicker. And I thought, well, how does this work? I'm only here for 2 months. What do they send me home or something? But anyway, they said, that's just paperwork, don't worry about that. So that really opened up my eyes. They give you a whole lot of money, go and do that. As an assistant cameraman, it was great. It was fantastic. So then one thing led to another, and as Butch had said, we were shooting in about 1966. The Eclairs came in, the NPRs, and I was made up to cameraman. I was overseas somewhere, and they said, oh, you're a cameraman, by the way, you're now on staff. And the cameraman that I'd been working with, mother got sick, and I had to fill in, and they said, well, do you think you're capable of shooting? I said, well, I've been shooting in Australia for 7 years or something. And one thing I had, the advantage that I had was that the trainees they took in every year, they came out of university with quite a high education. I'd managed to struggle through my intermediate, but I had the experience. So my holiday relief contract went on for 2 month periods over a period of 2 years. And then I got to that point, and then things started to open up. I just saw the world everywhere. I finished up doing 20 Wickers Worlds around the world. I worked with David Attenborough for 5 years, doing Ben in Bronzes, and then First Life on Earth was shot in Australia. We did Ben in Bronzes in Nigeria. We did the West Coast Red Indians in Canada. And you have an annual interview every year, you see. You go up to the old panelled office. They said, well, how was your last year? I said, well, it's very good. You know, what would you like to do? What are you doing now that you'd like to do tomorrow? I said, I'd like to do some drama. So I said, oh. They said, right, we'll do that. So I got into 30-minute theatre, and we did about 20 50-minute programs that were equivalent to like feature films. They were really good, fantastic scripts. This country just doesn't seem to get the script thing worked out. You know, it's the most important thing, no matter how good technology is. Unless the script's good, forget it. It doesn't happen. Or we make Australian films, forget it. Make international films. So anyway, that was happening, but I'm sort of stepping ahead a little bit. A program like the Snow Goose came up, and Robin Scott was the head of BBC Two at the time, and he was at a cocktail party, and ITV were in the running to pick it up. Paul Gallico wrote that famous book, and he wanted an English crew to shoot it. He didn't want the Americans to shoot it. Cocktail party, Robin Scott heard the conversation with the representative from ITV, and he got to Frank O'Connor, who was the American producer, and he said, look, we can shoot this film beautifully, and we can do it under budget, the budget you were talking about. So immediately things started to happen. I was doing a 30-minute film in a drama in Wales. Innes Lloyd, the producer, rang me up and he said, look, we've pulled off a bit of a coup here. This could be co-production money. And the BBC wanted money at that time. And it all came about. American producers said, all right, we need a big star. We need Paul Newman, Steve McQueen, something like that. They're all busy. Richard Harris is available. Oh, God, Richard. He finishes about 50% of the films that he starts. Great drinker, all the rest of it, so they had a problem. But America, Universal Studios called the tune, and they said, that's who we'll have. Jenny Agutter played the lead, and away we went on location. Now, they'd written into the contract that Richard couldn't be in London, so they built a lighthouse down in Frinton-on-Sea on the east coast, and he must stay there. It was part of it. First week of shooting went very well.
Is that because of the drinking?
No, the drinking hadn't quite started yet, or not that we knew of. And it was the contract was about the drinking. And, of course, first week was well, and then on the weekend we had 2 days off. Richard disappeared. They said, well, where's Richard? He's supposed to be here. He's gone. Monday morning comes around and no Richard. Americans are pacing around nervously. Anyone seen Richard? No, he's not here. He rolls into the set at about 11 o'clock in the morning. He has dyed his hair. He's got a black eye. He's got a limp. I thought, my God, here we go again. Producer comes up, Ray, what can we do? Can we filter out this problem? I said, well, talk to makeup, you know, they can solve all these problems. I said, I can't filter out the colour of hair. So Jenny Agutter was so good. She got to talk to him and said, you know, you can't let these people down. She was so young. But anyway, it all came together and the film went quite well. It was shown twice in America, twice in England. So the BBC, to me, really opened up my eyes. It was such an opportunity. So 2-month contract turned into 10 years. And I got a bit of problem with my chest and I had to come back here and do all that. But then I continued working for the BBC for about 30 years afterwards, based here in Sydney. So that all worked out well. Finally, I really shouldn't be alive. I did a documentary in Alaska and we were staying at Point Barrow. Getting up there is hard enough, let alone shooting anything up there. The director had found a bubble bell and he said, look, we need some cutaways of the Eskimos up in the village. And we got up there okay. The sound recorders were sitting in the back, but as a cameraman, you've got to watch what the pilot is doing. That's more important than anything else, what he's talking about, where the gauges are. So sitting in the front seat, you're looking at all that. And he's come back from Vietnam as a pilot, so he walked with a bit of link. He had a blinking eye. Oh, I've got some problems here. So we get up there. It took about an hour to fly up to the village. We were there, got all the good shots, and I said, look, time to go. That's it. Because the afternoon mist comes in at 3 o'clock in the afternoon and you've got to be on the ground and not in the air. He said, look, we're going past where I go of a day and there's these lovely bears and these antelopes and all that sort of thing. I said, no, that's not the film we're making, but if we're going past it, let's shoot it. So we did that. We're going back. I thought we should be back by now. You know, what's happening? The gauges are going down, down, down. And we'd been terrorising these damn bears. The big brown bears had their young with them and they were upset, you know, the fists were up in the air. And all of a sudden I said, well, where are we? Why aren't we back home? And home was a place called Dead Horse, could you believe? It was an American outpost. And I said, where are we? He said, I don't know. This bloody radio's not working, so he's thumping that. All of a sudden, we're out of fuel. The red lights are rolling. We're about maybe less than 1,000 foot, and down we come. He said, hang on, it's going to be a hard landing. So the Eclair hit my knee, and it hurt, but we were down on the ground. Not so much the ground, we were in the middle of a river. The water was running there, the water was running there. The pilot gets out and grabs a shotgun and grabs over to the other side. Where are you going? He said, oh, if I don't find something, we're in real trouble. We could freeze to death overnight. The bears had been following us, and they're on the other side of the river with their babies, you see. Anyway, I said to the sound recorders, for God's sake, get some sense out of this radio. So he did. He sent out an SOS, and another helicopter came round and they found us, lowered a 44-gallon drum. The pilot saw this and came running back, got in the chopper, it started, and we took off and got back to Dead Horse. So we had a lot of drinks that night, and we watched the aurora and all that sort of thing. So they were really good days. So that's a bit of Ealing, but what a privilege. There were 50 crews working there, all the cameras that Butch talked about, and you went with a lot of money each time you went out there, and they said, just come back and give us a good result. And we'd hand it over to the editors, like Bernard and Tony Eames here, right, who was there, and it was, they were good days. So let's have a look at something. Now this starts off with a BFI film, or part of a BFI film, that introduces a bit of the old Ealing studios as they were, and then there's another short film that shows Ealing TFS in 1960, and that follows by the Snow Goose, bits of that. So here we go.
Ealing Studios are in West London, on the District line, very easy to get to from the middle of London. One of the reasons why the studios sprang up here is because it was perceived to be a place that was close to London and yet didn't suffer from the air pollution that you got closer in. So there was light here. There was something that filmmakers could work with.
It's the longest continuing centre of filmmaking in the world. Filmmaking has been going on at Ealing since 1902.
This is BBC Television.
The address is Ealing Green. And the main administrative block was a private house long before it had anything whatever to do with film. Today, in the entrance to this building, a plaque reminds those of us who work here of our very distinguished inheritance. In the panelled room where Sir Michael Balkan sat, important decisions about films are still taken, but in 1960 they're decisions of a rather different kind.
Hello? Yes? Panorama? The Congo? Saturday? But that's tomorrow. Don't forget the other cruise in Formosa. Well, we'll manage somehow. Which town will it be? Elizabethville.
Today it's Elizabethville. Last week it was Formosa and Dublin. The week before it was the Greek islands. There are 25 camera teams based at Ealing in 1960, and 80% of their work is on location. Across the way, the conference room. Famous in the days of our predecessors for its round table, some of the most stimulating ideas in British films must have been born in this room, and today we still use it.
Reno, I noticed at Rush's this morning that some of the shots on the law, location shooting, had very high contrast. Did you notice this?
Yes, Dennis, I agree with you. Some of the shots were contrasted. But you know the conditions we have had to shoot under. A series of lawyers wearing black in white chambers. What can you do in such circumstances?
Yes, I know it's very difficult. Wouldn't it have been possible, for instance, to have produced blue robes for the lawyers so that we could have artificially reduced the contrast? We must never forget that we are in fact shooting for television and not for the cinema. And this is true whether we're shooting on the stages, on location, or in the lot.
Okay, got it.
Behind the doors of stage 2, a documentary about stunt artists.
Hi, Gordon. All right, now shooting this time. You ready, Alan? Yes. Grand fine. Now, just before we do go, if anybody does get hurt, please, nobody else touch it before. We've got somebody standing by to look after that. Okay, Bill, anytime you like. All right, let's have a red light and go for take, please. Keep it quiet, please. Turn them over sound. Mark it. Scene 152, take 1. Right, action. I have a minute.
next stage, a sequence for a schools program. And next door, the scenery is wheeled in for a drama production. Cutting rooms look and sound the same whether you're making films for the cinema or for television, and there are 30 of them at Ealing in 1960.
Stop! Release that man! It's a colonel speaking!
You to write a novel about it. They are not novelists. Monsieur Simonov, some of your critics have suggested that you've written too many novels. I apologize.
All in their hair, the plumes of birds of paradise, the bird we had travelled so far to film. We paid off our 100 porters, giving each one of us.
Our film vaults, serving a library with a staff of 25. The BBC's film library is one of the largest in the world, and every week it increases its size by more than 2 hours. The dubbing theatre. The BBC's film library is one of the largest in the world, and every week it increases in size by more than 2 hours. This seems a good place for us to end this very brief tour of Ealing in 1960, with me behind a glass case, reading the words that you can now hear. And so, as they say, back to the Cameo Cinema in Edinburgh.
BBC One, a moment or two, has Panorama, which this evening, on the 5th anniversary of the Six-Day War, confronts 2 young Israelis with 2 young Arabs in Cyprus to discuss their differences. Now, here's the weather forecast. Tomorrow in southeast England and East Anglia, the day will probably start cloudy with rain, but become brighter by afternoon and will then be mainly dry. In all other parts of the country, except the southeast, it'll be a day of sunny periods and showers. This is BBC Two. We now present again Paul Gallico's The Snow Goose, the film which has won awards in America and Monte Carlo, and most recently an Emmy for one of its stars, Jenny Agutter. Here then is the film, described by the New York Daily News as a most rewarding viewing experience, translated beautifully to television, a unique television hour done with care and integrity.
The Great Marsh lies on the Essex coast. It's one of the last wild places in England, a low, far-reaching expanse of grass and reeds, ending in the saltings and mudflats near the restless sea. Of human inhabitants there are none, with the occasional exception of a wildfowler or native eel fisherman. Hard by one of the winding arms of the River Elder, there stands an abandoned lighthouse. Once this lighthouse abutted on the sea. Time shifted land and water, and its usefulness came to an end. In it there lived a lonely man who had withdrawn from all human society. His heart was filled with love for hunted things. Although his body was misshapen, he created great beauty. He was a friend to all things wild, and the wild things repaid him with their friendship.
it, is it? Don't know. I never seen one like it hereabouts before.
Bloody have it, then.
Hold it, Jem. She's coming lower.
What about him?
Blast him. They've shot over his land before. Must you destroy everything of beauty that you see?
Not in your land.
It's my land. But you're welcome here. Without shotguns. Steady now. Thank God. She's alive. Not bad. It's just a flesh wound.
They shot her. She's hurt.
Yes. They shot her. She's hurt.
She's beautiful.
There now. Now. Fold the wing. Very, very gently. There. Now. Easy. Easy. There now. Now get some bandage. Under the body nice and gently. Across the wing. Under again. Tightly. There. There. That would about do it. We'll be wanting some ointment for the breast. Something delicate. I can get it from the village. She's coming back. She's going to stay, Frith. She's going to stay. She's going to stay. It's something stronger than instinct.
What is it?
It's attachment. She'll never fly away again. This is a home now. Of her own free will.
I'm glad she's staying with you. You'll not be so alone now.
Special announcement. The Admiralty have made an order requesting all owners of self-propelled pleasure craft between 30 and 100 feet in length, if they have not already been offered or requisitioned, to assemble at the channel ports and there await orders of the Vice Admiral commanding Dover. This most urgent request asks all civilian personnel to send every craft possible within the next 24 hours. I will repeat this announcement.
The wind is from France, their guns.
I'm afraid for you, Philip. Don't go.
These men are lost, Frith. Like the snow goose we found in the marshes and we healed. These men need help now. They need me. And I must go because I can. No one can stop me this time. Now, Frith. For once, Frith, I can be a man and play my part.
Take me with you, Philip. I can handle the boat while...
Your place in the boat would mean a soldier left behind, and then another, then another. I must go alone.
You won't come back.
Look after the birds for me, till I come back. Goodbye, Frith.
Where's Philip Rudder? Have you seen him?
Sorry, Frith. Do you mean the big fella with the beard and the humpback?
Yes.
Yes, miss, we saw him. He had a ruddy bird with him. Well, me and my mates have stood there in the water up to our waists.
Come on, all of you, come on!
All the smoke and noise, the Stukas bombing and strafing all round.
I can only take 7 at a time! But come on, come on! Come on! That's it, come on! Come on! I'll be back! I'll be back soon!
None of us would have made it but for him. He must have made 7 or 8 trips before... Well, before we lost sight of him.
You lost sight of him? What happened to him? Didn't you ever see him again?
I'm afraid we did, miss. We bedded him at sea.
Let go forward! Aye, aye, sir! All go forward! Let go out! All gone off! Slow ahead!
Godspeed, Philip. Godspeed.
Your place in the boat would mean a soldier left behind, and then another and another. I must go alone. Look after the birds for me, till I come back. Goodbye, Frith.
Thanks, Ray. Well, we've heard stories from Butch about what you have to do, about making sure it's in focus, making sure that you've got the exposure correct, and Ray with some of his challenges around coloured hair and bruised faces and limps. Yeah, and bears, and so the cameramen are out there capturing the image, but it's really up to the editor to make it work. So. Let's see how we. Well, let's see how we fix the problem in post.
Right. Thank you. Well, good evening, and it's a very hard act to follow two great cameramen and to talk about editing. Where, look, you choose to be an editor because you do not want to go outside and get your feet wet and walk in the snow, get shot at, and have your aeroplane fall down and out of the sky. You want to be in your cutting room and making it all into a movie. That's, I suppose, was a choice. Like many people, when I joined the BBC, you could have gone into sound recording, into cameras, into editing. Rightly or wrongly, I chose editing. Most of my enemies say, well, you got it wrong. But all my friends say, you probably got it right. I started in projection because I'd been very naughty while I was at school and spent 6 years every evening, weekend and holidays running film in cinemas all around London and getting paid for it and earning twice as much as my father, which he never quite forgave me for. And because of that, I was able to convince an appointment board in London that I was the right sort of person to be a projectionist, and became one of the preview projectionists in Ealing Studios. It's a wonderful row of cinemas, the E, F and G and 16mm, H, J and 35mm, and K 35mm nitrate, which I was one of the few allowed to use because I'd been running nitrate film for years. So it was really quite fun time to get into the BBC. I had my sights a lot higher. As I said just before the film ran, I chose editing. So I tried my first appointments board in late '62, and to a large number of people's around me chagrin, I got the job and became a trainee assistant film editor at the first bash, working on lovely shows like Panorama and getting into the business. Fell on my feet as I became a full assistant and spent 3 years with the remarkable Tony Essex on the Great War series, 26 films. And I did all the optical work for that myself, with Barry Tuvey as the chief film editor looking over me. and I did 1940, which was a 3-hour film by Tony, and then The Lost Piece. So I learnt a great love of archive, which I continue to use wherever I can when I go into anything to do with archive. And became a full film editor. It's not quite the story Ray had, being rung up to say you're a cameraman. I had to go through a couple of appointments boards. You know, the first one, I upset one of the members of the board. That's a jolly good way of making sure you don't get the job. But on the second one, they actually wanted somebody to do a job that nobody else wanted to do, and that was work on a very, very fast turnaround current affairs program. It wasn't really, it was a sort of social documentary series called Man Alive on BBC Two. And I spent 4 to 5 years on that. And I think I was able to experiment, and they gave me a lot of had to do things. They did want me to do 50 minutes in 2 days. They did like it that I managed it. They did like it that the one done in 2 days and won an award. They were very pleased with that. They kept giving me Christmas bonuses, so I was happy. But I wanted to go back to what I'd been doing as an acting editor, and which was drama. I love drama. I adore drama. So I eventually got back to Ealing Studios. I'd been at Shepherd's Bush doing Man Alive, and I got back to Ealing Studios, and wonderful. Yes, I'm back in drama. They said, do you want Dixon of Dock Green or a very bad series on boats called Warship? And I said, well, I've done Dixon of Dock Green because I did all those shots about 7 years ago with him coming out and say, evening all. And you do 15 of those, join them all together, and they're stored in Telecine ready for each episode. So I've done Dixon of Dock Green, I'll do Warship. So I did Warship. I did 3 series, again with a lovely opportunity to use library material from the Navy and to get into a lot of action and things. And I think I then at that point began to like making action work. That's why most of the things I like, we've got things blowing up or cars crashing or all that sort of stuff. Your own true self actually comes out in your editing, doesn't it, you know? And I no sooner started doing this, I got 2 series in, and they said, we see you haven't applied for the Chief Film Editors Boards. And I said, no, I will be a Chief Film Editor. I'm going to be. I've decided to stay in film. I've done studio direction. I've done in studios. I've had an attachment to videotape, but I want to stay in film. Yeah, I'll be a Chief Film Editor, but I'm not going now because those are 2 current affairs jobs, and I just got out of there. So they said, well, look, just do the board. You can always tell them. I said, yeah, okay. But I haven't got time to fill this thing. I said, oh, look, we'll just put an application in for you and just turn up. So I did. Got the job, and they said, you're back in current affairs. And I said, no, I'm not. I'm finishing this series first, and I did. And then was supervising on Money Programme, where I learnt a lot about finance, and looking after the Panorama again, where I'd started as a trainee, trying to get everybody to work on the shifts instead of the off shifts, so that they worked on the shift they were on, not on the week when they were off, which cost the BBC a lot of money. Because I managed that, they were very good to me, and decided to give me supervising editing on the second series of the very first thing that they did as all-film drama serials, serials, which was a thing called Target, which is an extremely violent cop show. And because I'd got away with that, they said, well, we're doing another thing called Shoestring. And I said, Shoestring? What's Shoestring? He said, it's a detective. So I did 2 series of that. And Trevor Eve wouldn't do it anymore because it was used as ratings fodder and played against the professionals. So they said, well, we've got another one now called Bergerac. So I did 10 years of Bergerac. Overlapping that, I managed to work on the Miss Marple series with Joan Hickson, virtually every one of them, although I did take a long holiday in Australia in 1984 while they were doing some of the editing on the first series, and fell in love with Australia, which is quite useful because my wife is an Australian citizen by descent, so that's how I could move here. And in fact, I stayed as the Chief Film Editor doing 18 years of serials supervising drama, and left the BBC in '94 by my own design, early retired, brought my twins of 3 and my new baby of 8 months, oh, and the wife, over to Sydney. and started ploughing around here doing work for commercial television that I'd never done. Channel 7 welcomed me. The ABC told me to go away because I'd come from London. And they thought I was trying to get their job. I also had a lovely interview where I went in with my CV, and it says on my CV, over 500 transmissions. And the guy interviewing me for the chief film editor job on a mainstream drama said, why is it lying on your CV? And I said, sorry? Beg your pardon? He said, it says you had 500 transmissions. Nobody can have 500 transmissions. I said, well, how many have you had? He said, 18. And I said, well, you haven't been doing it very long, have you? It's actually nearer 600. And he said, oh, it's rubbish. I said, that doesn't matter anyway, because I'd never worked with you, ever. And walked out and went over to Channel 7, and they gave me a job. So, look, I worked in documentaries. I've done commercials. I run my own Avid suite with my wife since '98, and we enjoy our time in Australia, and we don't work every day. It's just funny, but in the last 2 weeks, when I was trying to prepare a little chat and put some film together, we've been doing 5 things at once. She works by day, and I fall asleep by night, and I edit by night, you know. But it all works out, and look, everybody said, haven't they, it was great times at the BBC, and you know, it's absolutely right. But one of the things that we completely lose track of, in the 90s and noughties, I think we're supposed to call them that, we talk about the whole business of new technology and how it's all moving forward and it's wonderful. Hang on, 1960, 70, 80, and even 90 especially, the BBC was right at the big centre of all the new technology. There was a tremendous amount of new technology. When I joined the BBC in 1960, just before my 20th birthday, in case you want to do any maths, I hadn't realised until later that videotape, for instance, was still being spliced together with a razor blade. It was only the following year that I think an Editech or some such process was put together so that you could actually roll 2 machines and make it go... The precursor of rock and roll dubbing, which took, you know, another 8 years to turn up, because we used to run all our sound recordings in the dubbing theatre in one continuous run. We only ever used a 10-minute run because you couldn't get it right for more than 10 minutes. And in fact, you used to accept that maybe you never quite got it right. And believe it or not, one of my first things as an editor in '68 was to actually cut the very first program used in Theatre A dubbing theatre in rock and roll. It wasn't groundbreaking television. It was the comedy clips at the front of a Dick Emery show. But it was rock and roll, and we could get it right, and it was wonderful, and it went on to be a marvellous tool. Look, let's go back a little bit and talk about how film was in the beginning when I got there in '60. Yes, it was in Ealing Studios, and yes, 35mm, and yes, black and white, and yes, you saw 4:3. It stayed 4:3 until I left the BBC in 1994. We'd actually made lots of series for about 6 years in 16:9, latterly using Super 16. But we weren't allowed to transmit it like that, and we weren't allowed to master it like that. And one of my series, it was in 16:9, was mastered by us in 4:3. They found they couldn't really do it when they wanted to re-release it on video, so they re-released the masters we had in 4:3 and said, well, there it is, it's done. So look, 4:3 it was. 35mm was for drama inserts, documentaries, and all the arts like Hugh Weldon's Monitor. But 16mm, as you said, popped in '58. And in 1960, when I got there, it was being used for schools broadcasting. It was being used for magazine items, especially the women's programs in the afternoon, and for schools. And it was also being used, of course, in news by then, very much so. And when I did a bit of dubbing work as a projectionist in Alexandra Palace in '62, we were still in negative 16mm. And the sound was down the side. It was on a stripe, as the amateurs used to call it. Non-professionals used to call it. But of course, it was called edge track because, you know, that's where it was, on the edge. And the irony is that when I joined the BBC in projection, the separate magnetic track on the follow head, because we never used to sort of combine the track on one film strip, was also on the edge. And in the middle of 61, it was moved to the wide centre track. And, of course, much better quality. But the unfortunate thing was that for about a year, some films were centre track, some films were edge track, repeats were edge track, and so on. It was terrible mix-ups, I tell you. And it was right then, right back in the 60 earlies, that the BBC specialists started to try and work out how to get film in colour on air. And film in colour on air, you'd think, well, that's a piece of cake. You just run it in the telecine the same as you do in black and white. But, it wasn't quite that simple. One of the strange ironies is that the best colour on a telecine, and there will be those who tell you it in current affairs, that is a reversal film stock. It looks magnificent. It has a drawback. No, it has 70,000 drawbacks. One, it doesn't have a master. So current affairs, right through to 76 and beyond, was having to be spliced and live on air with dirt and joins and God knows what. But it did look lovely, but you couldn't dupe it. Not and want to see it. It looked worse than some of those VHS copies I just ran. It really wasn't good for duping. You couldn't think of a drama being made on it. It just didn't work. And so, yes, of course, in the end, we went to Eastman colour. But one of the biggest difficulties in going to any colour system was, for the editor, you got to pass a colour test. Because, of course, it was your responsibility to make sure your print was the right colour. And one or two of my colleagues fell by the wayside because they failed their colour test, which was great shame, and there was union difficulties and sadness all round. But you did have to know whether it was a super print that had come in from the labs. And there was another catch. You could cut your 35mm or your 60mm black and white, send it into Marjorie at neg cutting, and it would go off the following morning to the lab, and the morning after that, there was your single print, could go on air that night. The grading by eye from expert graders in the lab was so perfect, but there wasn't a problem in black and white. But in colour, well, we had to have an answer print. We had to see whether they could get it right. And then we'd tell them what we wanted changed, and then you'd have a show print. The trouble is, in the early periods of doing good drama, even as late as 78 and 9, I was having to go to 5 prints to get something that would run on telecine and look right without the colours being moved around on air, because we weren't allowed until 1986 to copy our films to videotape, except for special showings at Christmas and things like that. We had to run them from the telecine live, right through to 1986. I pushed some barriers on this, but got thumped. We'd have a second copy, one of the later answer prints, running 10 seconds behind it, and that's what went on air. If it got dirt from swarfing off TK27's top gate all over your film, as it did on one of my Bergeracs, so be it. You know, if there was any difficulty with your print, it would be driven like this. You know, it was not ideal. Eventually, about 1986, I got enough clout to be listened to and started to introduce the VTing of the films, and in order to keep them clean, I wouldn't let them even rewind them in telecine. I'd throw them into the top spool box myself, load it, and then rehearse record. And when it went wrong, stop, carefully wind back, and go on and record it, and then I'd edit them together in videotape, or I'd have somebody edit them with me in videotape. And eventually we came along out of those Mark II telecines, which were never perfect because opposite fields had a little flap for density, into the backbone of all recording transmissions at the BBC from film, and that was the Mark III telecine. But by the time I left, it was beginning to show troubles, because if any of you saw the first 3 series of Lovejoy, you'll know his face looked leathery, simply because they were neg transmissions, and the Mark III was not really up to that. It never survived good transmissions. But by then the money was so tight, and when they had got Spirit telecines in from Philips, they then wound down the telecine system just after I left. So, that was a waste of time and money, wasn't it? We did start that colour service in 1968, but we had in fact been running films to air in 67 to get people used to it and to try and get them to watch it in colour. But it was very interesting that because I worked on the Forsyte saga, although you won't find my name on the credits, because Bernard Ashby was your, oh God, they're ill, who will stand in? So I was Sheila Tomlinson several times during my career. We all remember Sheila and her dogs. So a lot of my early work, particularly before I was made up, you wouldn't know it was me, even if you were interested in knowing it was me. So I did all sorts of things on Poldark and an Eden line. I did eventually get 2 Eden lines with my own name on it. Right early on that, I was somebody else on Steptoe and Son, It Ain't Half Hot Mum. Oh, goodness knows how many other series. I suppose I've written them down somewhere. And it didn't matter, but eventually I did get 1 or 2 of my own credits on the films. Dad's Army, I did several of those, but eventually got my credit on them, So I go back right into that early history of TV, and I'm so delighted I was there, because we were talking about this just at the beginning of the evening. The BBC, quite rightly, has a wonderful reputation for its quality. And you worked so hard at doing that with often quite rudimentary kit. Think of a film cutting room in the 60s with, equipment that barely worked for the job, and yet you were churning this stuff out. And it looked really quite good, and it was really very presentable. And now the BBC still makes wonderful programmes. It's done it differently. It's got rid of its staff base, which made the whole thing function. Yes. And, when I joined the BBC, and for many years, right through to the late 80s, the beautiful thing about the BBC was that you did have a staff base, you did have all the studios. They were called below the line. You didn't have to charge them to programmes. The BBC paid for the staff, and it paid for the facilities, and the programmes cost you what you put in front of the camera. Now, suddenly we had some real costing come along in the late 80s and into the 90s, and a typical drama would have cost about £20,000 in the late 60s. Bergerac, which was a typical drama of the 80s and 90s, finished up at £375,000. And there was nothing different about making a 50-minute film, except that we had a new costing system and we were charging for it. And of course, in the end, you can't make as many programmes, and from thousands of programmes a year, the BBC makes hundreds in particular spheres. And that was why I left in the end. I felt that I had seen the golden days and I could find somewhere else to come, but I wanted to live and make myself useful in another place. Was interesting that one of the things I found in moving to colour was that the BBC in its wisdom had put its editors into colour courses in 1963. They really did know that colour was coming. It was far more important in many ways to the BBC than 625 lines, which was a given. The old 405 line pictures were quite small, rostered, and the 625 when BBC Two started was absolutely much, much better. And of course for colour, absolutely ideal. I was very interested to see the dubbing theatre on that early film, and you saw the counter going round, and I was reminded that of course you dubbed in 35mm feet even if it was 16mm film, because a 35mm foot, given its length, goes and the numbers turn round so that you say you want to mix on number 3, 1, 2, mix. 60 mil, because it gets more footage in its foot, the counter goes, yeah, yeah. I want to mix on 2 1/4, yeah, gone. Retake. Oh dear, we haven't got rock and roll yet. So that was extraordinary, and I mean, it is terribly interesting, but really the one single thing that it also meant was that you could dub in a complete reel of your film. We'd actually always used 10 minutes as that dubbing thing, so when rock and roll came in, we could actually put the film into the 25-minute reels that the laboratory would use, so that you only had the one join in your film instead of about 6 as it went through, which was rather useful. Generally, I think the goodish thing that we should really begin to talk about in a funny sort of way is not film, and that's videotape, because videotape had an enormous change through its history. And we all know that it started, as I said earlier, in quad, and frankly, you know, some of those 2-inch recordings are magnificent. You did have to do 2 lots at once because it head clogged and it gave up the ghost, but the actual recording quality, when you see some of those early comedy shows replayed now and remastered from the original tapes, they're just amazing. It was a wonderful system, but we were much happier in 73-ish when 1-inch took over, because we could hold frame. I remember working in presentation on an attachment, and you couldn't see the videotape before it got to the first frame, because it was still locking up, and there was no means of even seeing you got the right reel. You couldn't park on the label on the front and say, oh yes, it's the right reel. So you never led with the picture until the sound had come through. So all films off tape, all programs off tape, started slightly late at the start because you wanted to make sure you got the right thing on air when you lifted it. But once you could actually see a hold frame, you could check the board, make sure you got the right reel when you run it. And quite apart from that, making programs with something that you could actually see and stall was absolutely marvellous.
Sorry, with the move to 1-inch,
yeah,
there was a great advantage in that previously with the 2-inch tape, which was so expensive, the BBC would wipe over tapes. We lost a treasure.
Oh, particularly the landing on the moon, which was wiped for football. Yeah. The whole of the Warship series as well. Oh, yeah, wonderful. Yeah.
Were the film inserts.
That's right. Yes.
And it's a tragedy. And, you know, not only but also almost all of them.
I worked on that as well. Yeah. Amazing.
Like
yes.
Blue Peter.
Do you know I never worked on Blue Peter? Isn't that strange?
You won't get a badge.
No.
You won't get a badge.
You've got a badge too, have you? Gosh, wow. Well, you've got to miss out with something. I've got a sticker that says "Man Alive" somewhere. I used to have it on the back of my car until the football hooligans hit the motor car, because for some reason they didn't like it, but there you go. One thing I've not been mentioning too much is I did talk about sound stripe and edge track and whatever, but sound, of course, was terribly important to everything, and we've all heard how important sound is along the way. But look, unless Van Gogh is in the room, we've all got 2 ears. And therefore, it shouldn't be mono, should it? No. But television was one speaker, one ear, for a very long time. In fact, it was as late as 1983 when the BBC began to start thinking, well, perhaps we should be getting our programmes in stereo. But we have a problem here, particularly with film, because we go outside and look, never mind that CinemaScope has been in stereo since 1953, and all sorts of wonderful things have been around, and even our discs went over, and I'm going to get the date wrong, but I think it was about 1961. So why are we still in mono on television? Oh, look, we've sold colour sets now. Supposing we could sell it with 2 speakers, that would be a good idea. So the BBC started thinking about it, but there was a lot of worry about this because 2 speakers means 2 tracks. 2 tracks means a lot of difficulty in your dubbing and your track laying and your editing and all this stuff. So they came up with something called sum and difference stereo, which is actually a genius idea. You just stick a microphone up and you record both sides of it. And then you let the dubbing theatre sort it out. The recording from the front particularly sounds perfectly okay, so you put that on the centre track and you leave a difference on the edge track, and it's just recorded like that. It goes through the whole dubbing chain, and then in the dubbing theatre, well, it'll take a little longer, but we'll be able to make it turn into AB stereo. Of course, in the end, they didn't give us any more time to do that. You actually finished up dubbing your programmes in the usual 50 minutes equals 1 day for each thing, be it dialogue mix, effects mix, and then final mix. Didn't get any extra because it was going to take longer. But Bergerac Series 3, Episode 5 was the first trial in sum and difference stereo, recorded on location, and put through the edit chain by one of our loveliest of senior editors, Pam Bosworth, who agreed to come and cut on my show at the time. She was going to retire the following year. I'd worked with her as a trainee editor, and it was her episode which was retracked and reworked and finally transmitted on its repeat some years later in a stereo version. I did notice that on the box set it is actually the stereo soundtrack that's actually being used, so I was very comforted by that. And from then on, it was only a few years before that still remained one of the best ways of doing it. We introduced Dolby into the mixing system. I'm going to get the year wrong, but I'm thinking around 87, 8. But the BBC went for Dolby SR instead of Dolby A like the rest of London. You might think that's a silly thing to do, but it isn't, because if you track lay Dolby A, you have to have a separate band of tone for every single shot if you really want it to be perfect. Whereas you can put the transfer tone on the front of a reel, set it, and Dolby SR's much kinder. But of course, you still hear films running on the wrong Dolby. Our television channels here bring in American programs and either don't put the Dolby on or run the wrong Dolby, and you between each wire the speech like that where the background noise comes up. I've practiced that, and I talk out of sync. It's very easy to do, and it's really very disturbing. When they watch this film back, they will be worrying about it. Thank you. That's worth a round of applause. I missed a really important bit out quite intentionally. I turned 2 pages. And that is, before we actually had videotape that was workable, we did actually have film recording. 35mm film recording, by the time I arrived at the BBC in '60, was a very good state-of-the-art thing. Look, the coronation was recorded for a whole day on telerecording 35mm, and if you've seen it recently, it's staggeringly good. 35mm film was good. The system they used was good. You had to change recorder every 10 minutes because the reels were only 10 minutes long. So a guy who later became head of film transfers at Ealing, he actually was on the machines on the coronation day. I know because he told me so. And you had 3 recorders, 1, 2 and 3. That's very clever. Actually, they were called A, B and C, but I don't know why. And when A was about to run out of film, you fired off B, looking at the same or a similar roster. And then ditto when C came along. Well, C broke down halfway through the day, so we were left with only A and B. And there was a crisis. They nearly ran out of film stock because it all went on a bit longer than they were expecting. But in the end, within 48 hours, the processed film had been bolted together in the telerecording cutting rooms, which ironically became where I finished up for many years in Ealing. The telerecording rooms became the ones where I supervised most of my programs from 78 onwards. And the recordings were terrific, but they were also doing recordings in 16mm. They'd been used initially for internal checking. They used to actually record each transition in presentation and then turn it off. The objective being that they could sit and look to see whether the presentation was doing its job properly. Was it too rushed? Was it too slow? Was it impeccably announced? This is the BBC. And I didn't know what to do one night because I was in presentation on attachment, and the gentleman who does the announcements didn't turn up to do the shutdown of BBC One. So I said to my mixer, because you had somebody to do your mixing, you just said, and cut, and all that stuff. Lead sound and cut, you know, that stuff. The announcer didn't turn up. So I said, what do we do? And he said, well, we can't just shut the air down. He said, you'll have to go in and do it. I said, you're joking. I know I've done voiceovers, and I still do voiceovers, advert, anybody interested. But, you know, what do I do? And he said, you go in there, and when the bloody red light comes on, you speak. Thank you. So the bloody red light came on, and I said, this is the last programme tonight on BBC One, and this is Bernard Ashby on behalf of everybody here at BBC One, and of course BBC Two, which is closed down already, wishing you a very good night. We are back on air again on BBC Radio at 4 o'clock in the morning, and I think it's about 10 o'clock when BBC One comes on. Meanwhile, here's the national anthem. It fortunately wasn't recorded, and I'd been set up. They purposely didn't come back in because it was one of my last days on attachment, and I think it was fun, but it was part of the joy of programme making in those days, you know. It's very interesting. We momentarily talked about the 1-inch being a good recorder for a very, very long time. And it was. And I actually ran about 2 weeks ago a home screening of the latest DVD package of one of the Miss Marple films, which I had the greatest of joys working on, called A Caribbean Mystery. I cut the first half, and one of my colleagues, whose parents live in Sydney, cut the second half. So we had a big family screening and some invited friends over in the lounge to look at it. And very quickly I realised that it was actually the master made by the best telecineast in Britain called John Crane, now retired, and the best engineer in telecine, John Morgan, now retired, and of course one of the very fine film editors, now retired. And we ran this film through, and it was our master from the 1-inch in 1989, which had simply been copied to Panasonic D3, which was what the BBC chose to install initially instead of the Betacam Digital, because the Betacam Digital didn't do a good job on the sound initially. And so they put 20 suites of 3 machine Panasonic D3s in, and that's just in London TC alone. And that was mastered on that, and I imagine then sent into some file or other, perhaps via Betacam Digital even, but the same print that we prepared that night and crossed over 2 nights, 7 a.m. to 3 a.m., 7 a.m. to 3 a.m., because there were 1 or 2 flaws in the print stock, as was quite regular in the late 80s. The French stock was released to us, which had got blobs all over it, and we used to box them and repair them. You can now do it live, but we used to have to do it manually, taking 1-frame edits. Telecineast on the left, me in the middle with the 9001 controller, and John on the right, making sure all the boxes and things were done right. We really cared about making our films look fantastic, and I was just so heartened to see how good that recording was. It was unbelievable, because of course we saw everything right through to when I left 94 on tube television, the old cathode or whatever it was later called. LCD and all the others and plasma came out later. You now watch it on a great LCD or similar TV. You're seeing the quality in a way that you didn't know you were making it. I held the record of 24 million in one night of drama for many years. And if we didn't get 18 million in the 80s, then there was something wrong. That's how things have changed. Hope you've enjoyed the evening and I haven't bored you too much. Cheers.
Thank you very much. That was very interesting. We're also looking for more ideas for these sorts of sessions. So if you enjoyed tonight and you want to see something different, a tour of a facility or somebody speak, just let us know and we'll see if we can arrange it for you. Thank you very much.